my opinion, depth of field is one of the most overlooked aspects of cinematography when it comes to film theory. Choosing what to and what not to keep in focus is much more important than you might initially think. But let's start with the basics. What is depth of field and how can it be achieved? The definition of depth of field is the distance between the nearest and the furthest objects in frame, giving a focused image. This can basically be narrowed down to what's in focus and how blurry the background is. There are two main distinctive types of depth of field: shallow focus and deep focus. Shallow focus can be achieved through having a wide aperture, a close focus range, and focus distance to the subject of the shot. Deep focus can be achieved by doing the adverse of this. Nowadays we see an abundance of shallow focus used in films and video content in general, as it's an easy way to make an image look aesthetically pleasing. However, that doesn't mean that there's no place for deep focus, and it still appears in many films. As a side effect of deep focus is that less light is picked up by the camera due to using a closed aperture. Wider apertures were used much more frequently in early cinema, as there was a lack of powerful lighting technology. However, now that technology has evolved, there's really no excuse for filmmakers not to experiment with the use of depth of field, which leads me to my next point. How can we create meaning and tell a story using depth of field? Well, as with all aspects of film, there's no single objective answer. However, there are many examples of ways filmmakers have utilised depth of field in the past. A fairly recent example is in Spike Jonze's Her, where we see our main protagonist Theodore displayed as disconnected from society through the use of shallow focus and shots where both he and the skyline appear. This idea evolves as the film continues. In the scenes where Theodore begins to become more connected to the world around him, we see a larger reliance on deep focus, having both him and his surroundings in focus at the same time. Another classic example is in Citizen Kane. In this scene, deep focus is used to keep Kane as our central subject of the frame, even though he is the smallest person in it. This helps display how his life is in others' hands and the insignificance he has over his fate. The majority of tracking and one-take shots use deep focus as well, as by keeping all elements of the frame in focus, it allows for less focus pulling to be done and a more advantageous shot to be achieved. Shallow focus is also apparent in horror, where having a blurry background can create suspense, as anything that appears in it is kept ambiguous. Furthermore, it can also help shift the audience's attention from one subject to another quickly. However, we shouldn't necessarily think of depth of field as being a binary concept with shallow and deep focus, but a majority of films choose to still have elements of a shot out of focus only partially. This brings me on to my next point. I feel like films and video content in general are beginning to overuse shallow focus as an easy means of making a shot look aesthetically pleasing over actually containing meaning. Similar to the growing popularity of long takes, a shallow depth of field can draw so much attention to itself at times that it can detract from other elements of the frame. Take Rogue One for instance. The film uses extensive shallow focus throughout but never utilizes it and ends up being more of a limitation. For instance, in this scene the environment is very dull and completely forgettable, which is only exacerbated through the use of shallow focus, which allows us to become separated from the background our character is in. Note how the editing adds to this, as whenever the focus does shift from shallow to deep, we cut back to a shot that uses shallow focus again. Instead of enhancing the visuals, this acts as more of a storytelling restriction which continues throughout the film, allowing for less to be told about our characters, something that was seriously lacking throughout the whole of the film. I'm not saying that depth of field is the main factor that would have saved the film, but it certainly should have been taken into consideration. In contrast to this, let's examine a film like The Shining. Director Stanley Kubrick relies much more heavily upon deep focus in shots where we can see the environment, helping establish and develop it, something crucial for any horror film set in an isolated location. Even when he does use shallow focus, it still has great effects, such as when Danny encounters the sisters for the first time. The shallow depth of field at the start of the shot helps isolate Danny from his environment. However, as we zoom out, we become more aware of the environment itself, which is open to much more interesting detail on further reading. After zooming back into Danny's face and in turn using shallow focus once more, the shot is juxtaposed by a deep focus shot of the sisters. This apposition of focuses helps enforce Danny's isolation in the situation. Once again, depth of field isn't the only aspect of cinematography contributing towards this effect, but it's still imperative in its overall presentation. Despite my criticism of it, I'm not saying that shallow focus is necessarily bad, but with the ease it can be achieved with modern technology, it's hard to argue that it's not being overused. After all, every shot in cinema has a depth of field, so it only makes sense for filmmakers to take advantage of it. Thanks for watching.